Welcome back to our conference in celebration of the career and scholarship and retirement of our colleague Michael Fishbane. My name is Jeffrey Stackard. I teach Hebrew Bible here in the Divinity School, and it's a real honor for me to be able to chair this session. I have never been able to catch up to Buzzy. I arrived at Brandeis after he left, and I was not fortunate enough to be his student. But then I did arrive here at Chicago in time to share time on the faculty with him. And though I didn't get here in time to be his student, I did get to share years on the faculty. And so it's a real pleasure to be part of this conference. Our speakers this morning are two scholars who were fortunate enough to be Buzzy's students. We have two papers. The first is from Laura Lieber, who is visiting professor of religious studies at Duke University, where she also directs the Center for Jewish Studies. And she is also the inaugural chair for transregional religious history at the University of Regensburg, a position she'll take up in the coming year. Her paper this morning is entitled The Eros of Abraham and the Poetics of Pietonic Intertextuality. So, Laura.
Yeah, just a little more. Thank you.
Perfect.
So my first quarter at the University of Chicago, I was taking a class on Shir HaShirim. I remember Alicia was in the back, and I was in the front row, terrified, wondering what I'd gotten myself into coming to Chicago. And in the library, I bumped into John Schofer, who was a more advanced graduate student at the time, and he mentioned that he heard that Professor Fishbane had gotten very interested in PU-team, and that maybe because I had just come out of HUC, I had read some of those, and maybe I would want to do my paper on some PU-team. And I thought, oh, I did study some PU-team at HUC with Rick Saris, and I could do that. And so I went and saw Professor Fishbane in his office hours and said, maybe I'll do my paper for the Shir HaShirim class on some of those Passover PU-team that I did in my Liturgy 1 class with Rick Saracen. And I never looked back. So it's a real pleasure to be here this morning. And of course, I couldn't really speak here this morning, and not have something with the word eros in it, and intertextuality, and the Song of Songs. And when in doubt, I always turn to the Parshat HaShavua. So I'm looking at the Eros of Abraham and the poetics of biblical intertextuality. And here's an image from the Leipzig Machzor, and a beautiful image of a piyut from Passover based on Shir HaShirim. Because my section is actually on Hebrew Bible and not actually on rabbinics, which is where I would sort of normally classify myself, I wanted to start by looking at how PU-team relate to the Hebrew Bible. And in honor of Professor Fishbane, I wanted to go all the way back to biblical interpretation in ancient Israel, and how PU-team really can be seen as an extension of how the Hebrew Bible itself interprets itself. The way the chronological span of the Hebrew Bible means, as we heard last night, that the Bible itself reaches back into itself, and how the older texts are reinterpreted by the later texts, and how later readers of older texts continually reinterpret the biblical text itself, and how these sort of callbacks pull the threads together and weave the older biblical texts into these later biblical texts, and weave the biblical text into a tapestry of interpretation, and how ever later readers of the text become attuned to these delicate echoes and allusions, and eventually sensitive readers could discern, and perhaps even in some cases hear or even invent resonances in the subtlest of places. And so for today's presentation that I will be sharing with you, I want to look at one example of a passage from the Hebrew Bible that illustrates how sensitive readers from a much later period, in my case the 6th century of the Common Era, could hear in a biblical text echoes and allusions and weave together biblical language into a novel composition that's richly textured by the ancient language of the Hebrew Bible for the purpose of speaking meaningfully to a new community. And in my case, I'm looking at Genesis 12. So here from biblical interpretation in ancient Israel, a quotation. Abraham was clearly understood as anticipating in his lifetime the destiny of his descendants. Such a typological reshaping of a narrative tradition about Abraham helps explain the use of the verb hotzitecha, I took you out, in Genesis 15:7, in connection with Abraham's migration from Ur. Since there is no explicit biblical tradition that Abraham was in any peril in his homeland, one may conclude that this particular term was chosen because it was part of the stock of traditional terms used to convey the Exodus, and the narrator wished to establish a typological nexus between the two events. And what I will show you in the composition from the 6th century is the way the piyut draws together in the same way that we see in Genesis 15, as Professor Fishbane pointed out in that passage from Biblical Interpretation in Ancient Israel, the way Genesis 12 becomes, as I put here, sort of a florilegium, it becomes part of a bouquet of verses, that a cluster of biblical verses are attracted around Genesis 12:1 that create a whole image of interpretations around Abraham's departure from his homeland. Lech lecha, go forth from the land of your fathers to the land that I will show you. So as we say here, the Eternal said to Abraham, go forth from your land, from your kindred, and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. Then God said to Abraham, I, the Eternal, who brought you out of the land of Ur of the Chaldeans to assign you this land as a possession. How a whole host of biblical verses are attracted and become associated with this image of Abraham leaving his ancestral land and color this departure of Abraham from this land and lend it a whole host of agadic images that become part of how the liturgical poet will eventually present this passage in the synagogue in late antiquity. And what you notice, and I will not read all of these verses to you, but one of the things that you will notice is that these verses are colored not just with a tradition of departure, but actually, as we see, as in Psalm 45:11, pay heed, O daughter, and see, incline your ear and forget your father's house. And from the Song of Songs, draw me after you and let us run. The king has brought me to his chambers. Let us exult and rejoice. That these are indeed quite romantic and even erotic verses, as well as various other emotional and quite powerfully emotional and erotic connotations. But all of these resonances are rooted in a cluster of biblical verses that later interpreters will take of these. And the image that I always find from late antiquity that is particularly compelling is to think of them, these biblical verses are like the stones of a mosaic. And in the same way that the mosaic was one of the dominant art forms from late antiquity, and that they're made as the stone, that the small stones are set, and from them you compose a larger image that is only visible from a certain distance, that these phrases are the stones that are then set and aligned, and they don't always mesh quite perfectly, but when you step back and you look at them, a new whole image appears and can be seen. So these verses cluster together, and often when you pull one verse, so when you pull Genesis 12:1 from its context, these other verses are sort of pulled along with it as a cluster of associations. And so it's this image of pulling of threads, and I say that you pull on the thread and you reveal a body of yearning. And what we see here is that Genesis 12:1 in a way becomes sort of a miniature version of the Exodus. And that's what we saw in biblical interpretation in ancient Israel, that Abraham is sort of a paradigm, sort of a small form of the Exodus. And this is what we see here. So the Exodus from Israel is sort of a national version of the story, and the Exodus is elopement, the wilderness is a honeymoon. Shavuot as the marriage, and the Torah as the ketubah. And what we see here is this tradition is sort of read back. It's read into the Exodus in some ways, and it's read back further into Abraham's story. Abraham's trek from Ur to Canaan in Genesis 12 anticipates this national romance between God and Israel. God calls Israel, and here we have in Isaiah, which is one of those verses on the previous slide, Zerah Avraham Ohavi. Israel is called the seed, the descendant of Abraham, my love, which suggests an intense emotional connection between Israel as the child of Abraham, my love. At early Midrashim on Genesis 12:1 from Bereshit Rabbah use these sort of charged Hatiphta verses from afar, which suggest an early association between Abraham and these sort of erotic verses. And just quickly here, you'll see that they sort of, I say here the quiet part stays quiet, and that the verses are charged, but the midrashic development doesn't necessarily take us into the love song part of it, we might say. So you see here in Genesis Rabbah 39:1, we have the verse from Psalm 45:11. So Rabbi Yitzhak opens his discourse with, "Pay heed, O daughter, and see, incline your ear." Again, we have in 39:2, the opening verse is, "The scent of your perfume is pleasing." I will not say anything about this text while Debbie Green is in the room. That's about perfume. And then again, in the very next Hatiphta, we have a little sister, another verse from the Song of Songs. So, but again, the Midrashim themselves are fairly delicate in terms of the interpretations they offer, but it's clear that there is sort of an association between God summoning Abraham from Ur and these verses that incline towards romance or eroticism. Turning to Yanai and the Piyutim, we have the Piyutim. For those who don't know, Piyutim are a genre of liturgical poetry. They were presented in the synagogues in late antiquity, so we've now sped up. We're in the 6th century of the Common Era. The land of Israel has been thoroughly Christianized. If you imagine the synagogues, those beautiful synagogues with the mosaic floors, and such as Jody Bagnus and Eric Myers excavate, Stephen Fine, so the imperial period, as it were, of like Justinian and Theodora, and so the synagogue liturgy. So these poems were presented in place of they embellished the statutory prayers of the synagogue on Shabbat morning. And in each poem took place on Shabbat morning, and in place of what we would now have as sort of the statutory prayers, there was a new composition. So it's like a cantata. So instead of the fixed prayers that we would now have, there was a new composition. And the congregation would join in at various parts, and they would sort of stick the bracha. They would sort of like, the way you stick the landing. They would join in for the congregation would sort of know their lines, as it were. They join in for various rhymes and refrains and other parts. And part of the art form was knowing sort of that the paitan, the poet, was going to offer a new composition each week. And they want to know how the poet was going to weave the Torah portion for the week and the Haftarah, the prophetic portion for the week, into the Amidah, the main prayer for the synagogue, and then they would also and weave it sort of into the Amidah, and the congregation would sort of be participating in sort of the part of the service. So it was sort of a dynamic art form, and so the synagogue service would actually change from week to week, but the congregation would be sort of drawn in and participating in parts of it. And so it was a very sort of participatory, dynamic way of bringing the Torah portion quite literally sort of to life and participating in it each week. And Yanai's works were almost entirely lost until they were recovered from the Cairo Geniza. They were fixed in their pattern. The congregation had to sort of be able to predict sort of formally what was going on so they know when they were supposed to join in. But then there were themes and variations, and they're very complicated, but at the same time predictable. They involve a lot of speech and character, and they were very dramatic in a lot of ways. And in a lot of ways, Yanai's Kedushta, because it culminates in the third blessing of the Amidah on God's holiness. So the holy, 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 kadosh, 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 this climactic moment in the Amidah. Yanai's Kedushta for Genesis 12:1 is in many ways just representative. It's not, his best work ever, or, it's not sort of a mediocre one. It's a beautiful exemplar of the genre. It just happens to be one for this week's Torah portion. So it's a very nice example. And it shows how Abraham's departure from Ur illustrates how the poet weaves the Song of Songs into this moment. And this is an example just from the Chiroganese. You can see how, again, just formally, even if you don't know Hebrew or anything, how on the page the poetry is distinctive on the manuscript page. And this is just a palimpsest, how there's Greek underneath. So you can see that Yanai was overwritten. This is a Chiroganese fragment. But you can see how the poetry stands out from the other prose on the liturgical page. So I'm not going to read this whole text, but what I want to highlight for you is that the poet, that it starts out with, it's addressed, this is the opening unit, so that the poet speaks here directly to God. A lover amidst the hated ones you, O God, acquired. A creature you endowed, allowed to create. So it's speaking to God of Abraham. So one radiant among those dwelling in darkness, you, O God, perceived. The ways of his heart you fathomed. So the poet here is speaking intimately, directly to the deity. And it's as if the congregation is eavesdropping on an intimate conversation between the poet and God. So it's a sense of intimacy. And then, like an only daughter, you led him, and like a little sister, you drew him near. So again, it's this intimacy. And I'm not going to sort of like walk you through. The footnotes that I could offer you on each line of this would be overwhelming. And then you'll notice how at the end of it, so like a little sister, you drew him near, clear amidst the clouds, you saw him, like sweet talking lasses, you enticed him. So it depicts God as seducing Abraham out of Ur. And then it's followed by a list of proof text, including the first verse of the Torah portion, Genesis 12:1, Psalm 45:11, 45:12, Song of Songs 1:4, and then it ends with the first blessing of the Amidah. Blessed are you, O shield. Just to give you a sense of the dense intertextuality, because I did promise you intertextuality, just here a few phrases. So, a lover from among the hated ones, that very first phrase. It's a weaving together of Isaiah 41:8, Song 2:2, and it's punning on the root kane, to acquire and create, but also kinui, love and marriage. And similarly, chinuch wrote pitito. So chinuch wrote from Proverbs 22:6, to train up a lad in its context, but punning on chinuch with the sense of seducing. And then peti from Hosea 2:6, but again with that sense of seduction. And I had to put in here a quote because I couldn't imagine this rabbinic literature. This is a conversation I once had with Professor Fishbane. I told him I can't imagine rabbinic literature without the Song of Songs. And he said, because there's so much love and romance and covenantal language, and he said, if there hadn't been a Song of Songs, the rabbis would have had to invent it out of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Hosea and other. Because it just was everywhere. It was like Tootsie Rolls everywhere I think I see. So it becomes the Song of Songs to me. So, which is why, so you can, and here, actually I had a quotation from, because the Song of Songs was everywhere in these stanzas that everywhere in this poem. I mean, I couldn't footnote for you this whole Kedushta, but the Song of Songs. And so obviously the commentary here, and I have a quotation from Professor Green's review of it in the Jewish Review of Books. but it's a work of innovation and restoration at once. Going through, I can't obviously go through the entire Kedushta with you in the time that's allowed. I mean, this is a poem that's designed to be the centerpiece of a full synagogue morning service. But I want to touch on for you that the third unit also weaves in the Haftarah, which is, again, the Haftarah, it's a biblical text, which in some ways it's not edited. The Haftarah, you read it's from the Bible. You're reading it. It's not with commentary, but at the same time, because it is, the rabbis always, the rabbis choose when you start and when you stop. So it's edited in a way that itself is a commentary. And Yanai's works permitted us to recover much of the Haftarah cycle from the land of Israel in late antiquity. And so we have here the Haftarah from when Yanai's community would have read Genesis 12:1. And here I just want you to see that it continues Yanai's address to God, and as he continues to narrate the relationship between God and Abraham. A hand to the patriarch you extended, and by his charms were you aroused. So again, quoting more from Psalm 45. Before him did you walk to the land to which you led him. So again, it just continues the conversation between God and Abraham. The beauty of his blessing you multiplied for the many. Blessed seed from his seed you made grow. And here it always pivots to the community of the poet's own time and the Haftarah, which is sort of in the present tense. The poet always turns to his own community with the transition to the Haftarah, which is from the book of Joshua in Yanai's time. And so here, the Haftarah commentary. So Yanai's piyutim, which were essential to the reconstruction of the Haftarah. Poem 4, I know here that it's irregular. It continues, though in this case, in the second person. It revisits. It goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And here we have more agadah. We have here the introduction more explicitly. Earlier in the poem, there were references to Abraham being in danger and this idea that God was somehow rescuing him from some sort of danger. And here we have more explicitly that he was from darkness and gloom, and that he was his father's images he hammered to bits. And here we have sort of the depiction of Abraham in I have the image of Abraham in the ovens. So more explicit agadic imagery here. It gets more narrative as it goes. Here's another nice little medieval image of that. And just keeping an eye on the time. And finally, in poem 6, which is the longest, most narrative poem of the entire composition, God speaks. So finally, it quotes from Genesis 12:1, "Go forth from your land." God speaks, "You for whom I waited from the first, watching for you for 10 generations, among all I found your heart most true. Thus into the fiery furnace I went with you." So here we have the poet who's been speaking and speaking and speaking to God of Abraham. And finally here, beginning with this quotation from Genesis 12:1, now God speaks. And the poet goes on, and this is the longest, most narrative unit. So it's creating this whole drama. And the poet speaking, and here I'll call back to a beloved teacher who's no longer among us, Menachem Brinker, who again, that first quarter, that wonderful first quarter I had here in Chicago, who enacted, he said the poet would stand here, and he would run over here, and then he would run over here, and he would act, which is, it's no wonder I just wrote a book about drama in the ancient synagogue. So, but you just sort of have the sense of how, that they were bringing this to life for their community, and how the community was just sort of understanding everything that was sort of at stake. And this is the decree I declared to you, my lover, arise and come away with me. So in that first unit, where the poet says, I seduced you, Abraham, now we're being told what he said, my lover, arise, come away with me. So the way it loops back and loops back, and sort of, it's like it gives you sort of a little bit of a hint first, and now it's going back and it's fleshing out the story more and more. So, and then we have sort of, as it gets closer and closer to the Kedusha, to this sort of like mystical moment where Israel is going to join with the angels in prayer, the poem, it gets more and more sort of rapid. So we have these sort of, it transitions and we get these units that are called rahitim, runners, and it gets sort of faster paced and more ecstatic in a way, less narrative. And we have these units, and the community is joining more and more. So we can see here, especially in the second unit, where they're going bracha, 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 a blessing, a blessing, a blessing, and a blessing to which there is no equal, a blessing with nothing lacking, a blessing revealed to every nation. This idea that this is the consequence of this relationship that's that's between God and Abraham, sort of all the benefits accruing to the congregation as a result of this one sort of like relation God and Abraham that's accrued for the nation of Israel, that's sort of is overflowing, a blessing for him and for all of his descendants. And then it gets closer and closer. So back to the poet's voice speaking to God. So it's getting ever closer to the Kedusha. It stands forever. It endures eternally. It lasts forever. It does not cease. It does not diminish. It gets breathless and sort of rapid. You don't even know there's no it's like there's no punctuation in the Hebrew anyway. But even like sort of when you're trying to figure out where to like sort of like what you should, as a translator, what I should be doing. Enduringly bright among the angels, it's getting closer and closer, and the congregation is sort of like getting more and more sort of wrapped up in this sort of as they're literally sort of joining the angels in prayer. You called to him with your word, returning like a bolt, and who returns in a flash, fly like an arrow, who cry in a tumult and respond, here we are. In the name of the holy, the hallowed in holiness. And then they rise as the moment of the Kedusha, and the composition is complete. And they culminates in the words of Isaiah 6 and Ezekiel 3, the holy, holy, holy. But that's liturgical, not Yanai's composition. So what would I say? Language matters. The piyutim are written in Hebrew, which means that they use and reuse biblical idioms in their original language, preserving and conveying and amplifying all the elusiveness and ambiguity of the original. The scriptural phrases constitute cultural touchstones, words and resonances evocative and powerful, and the meaning deepens with reuse. As they get turned and turned, they mean more and more. The piyutim distill and extend techniques familiar from Midrash, themselves rooted in the Hebrew Bible and often echoed in other genres. So they often, sometimes I think of them as actually taking Midrash and distilling them down to their essence almost, as we'll see in my final slide. They make use of all the performative techniques that we know from antiquity. There's orality, participation, sound play, communal experience, and even, I think, physicality. So I think it was sort of exegesis in motion. So there's the ethopoeia, the speech in character, ekphrasis, the vividness, the enargeia, and other techniques that we know from late antiquity that were important in the use of performance and oratory and all sorts of other forms of effective engagement with an audience and listeners, because this was how you made texts meaningful. And the conclusion of biblical interpretation in ancient Israel, Professor Fishbane writes, this brings me to the end. The whole phenomenon of interbiblical exegesis requires the latter-day historian to appreciate the fact that the texts and traditions, the received traditum of ancient Israel, were not simply copied, studied, transmitted, or recited. They were also, and by these means, subject to redaction, elucidation, reformulation, and outright transformation. Accordingly, our received traditions are complex blends of traditum and traditio in dynamic interaction, dynamic interpenetration, and dynamic interdependence. And in my mind, in a way, I think of the piyutim as being like the bringing to life of this slide. And here I picked 3 verses that I particularly love. The Eternal said to Abraham, "Go forth from your land, from your kindred, and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. Pay heed, O daughter, and see. Incline your ear and forget your father's house. My beloved spoke to me, arise, my darling, my beauty, and come away." These 3 verses, read together as part of the same whole, overlaid over this dynamic image where you see 2 figures in the background and 2 figures in the foreground, implying motion from a past to a present to a future. Something has happened, something is happening, words are read together, and words are as yet unresolved. Tradition, interpretation, ongoing, a gift. Thank you, Professor Fishbane.
I should have mentioned at the beginning, we're going to hold questions until the end. So we'll have our second paper and then have a conversation with both of our speakers. Our second paper this morning is from Benjamin Summer, who is Professor of Bible and Ancient Semitic Languages and Senior Fellow at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America and Senior Fellow in the Center for Contemporary Jewish Thought at the Shalom Hartman Institute. His paper is entitled Prayer, Ritual, and Silence, the Psalms as Worship in Biblical Scholarship and the Phenomenology of Religion. So Ben, please, and there's a handout.
Thank you, Jeff. And thanks to all of you for being here. Thank you, Buzzy, for more than I can express right now in words. Thank you very much. Biblical scholars in this country often have positions in departments of religion. So it is ironic that few biblical scholars draw upon or contribute to the phenomenological study of religion or to the field of history of religions. Happily, Michael Fishbane has always bucked this trend. Already in his earliest publications, such as his 1975 essay on the sacred center in the Bible, Buzzy has drawn upon work by theorists of religion. It is thus appropriate, I think, that he took a chair here in Swift Hall, a locus widely regarded as an omphalos for the academic study of religion. I'd like to talk today about the relationship between biblical criticism and religious studies by examining the way that 3 seminal scholars, Hermann Gunkel, Zygmunt Mowinckel, and Yechezkel Kaufmann, describe the relationship between psalms and sacrifice. We'll see that their descriptions line up with approaches to prayer and ritual among theoreticians of religion, even though the 3 scholars I discussed tended not to refer to theoreticians. Contextualizing Gunkel, Mowinckel, and Kaufmann within a theoretical discourse sheds light on what these scholars were really up to, even if they themselves didn't realize the links between their work and larger trends in the study of religion in the academy. This context can help us evaluate the ways these scholars and students of Scripture generally think about the nature of worship in the Bible. Many readers of the Bible presume that the Psalter and Leviticus represent 2 fundamentally different kinds of religiosity. For these readers, the beauty and song of the one are at odds with the blood and guts in the other. This judgment reflects a broader presumption common in modern Western culture. True prayer is far removed from mere ritual. Ritual is at best a pale reflection of prayer, useful perhaps for the inarticulate among us. Of course, this attitude that I've just described misrepresents how Psalms functioned in ancient Israel as well as in traditional Judaism and most forms of Christianity. There was no divide between prayer and ritual in the ancient Near East. Understanding Psalms as a type of ritual helps us to understand the religious experience that Psalms reflect and encourage. Positing an opposition between prayer and ritual, on the other hand, prevents scholars from recognizing those experiences at all. The three scholars I discussed today approach these issues in different ways. For Gunkel, psalms and sacrifice inhabit opposite ends of a polarity. As genuine religious poems, psalms were independent of the temple cult, though they imitated the forms of older texts that once played a role in the temple. Mowinckel represents an antithesis to Gunkel's perspective. He argued that psalms accompanied rituals in the temple. Thus, Mowinckel encouraged biblical scholars to adopt a more capacious understanding of how worship functions in actual religions. In his respect for what we might term priestly religion, Mowinckel is more sympathetic to Jewish and Catholic perspectives than Gunkel. Surprisingly, Kaufmann, one of the most influential biblical scholars of modern times, especially for Jewish biblical scholarship, Kaufmann initially seems closer to Gunkel. Kaufmann claimed that sacrificial worship in Leviticus and Numbers shunned psalmody and prayer. I'll propose, however, that Kaufmann's approach synthesizes elements found in Gunkel and Mowinckel. Although Kaufmann speaks of an opposition between psalmody and sacrifice, his work helps us to realize that prayer is a type of ritual and that silence can be a type of prayer, indeed a sacrificial form of prayer. In order to understand the place of these three figures in the history of scholarship, it will be useful to realize that various phenomenologists of religion display diametrically opposed understandings of prayer that reflect divergent conceptions of religion itself. The classic that everybody loves to hate is Friedrich Heiler's Prayer, a Study in the History and Psychology of Religion. Heiler makes a strong distinction between prayer on the one hand and ritual, magic, and sacrifice on the other. Thus he writes, and I'm on the first page of the handout here, prayer was originally quite independent of sacrifice. Skipping out a little. Originally, sacrifice was completely at the service of prayer, but it gradually rose out of a subordinate into a commanding position. Heiler proceeds from the assumption that prayer and sacrifice are separate and hostile, so that each must be in a commanding or subordinate position. The possibility that they work together is not addressed. Prayer versus sacrifice is not the only dichotomy that Heiler presents. He contrasts spontaneous, free prayers uttered by individuals with formulaic prayers imposed by a communal hierarchy. This dichotomy appears in the opening sentences of Heiler's work, again on page 1 of the handout. He writes, "The free, spontaneous petitionary prayer of the natural man exhibits the prototype of all prayer." Skipping ahead, it is strongly repressed by ritual prayer and the fixed forms of exorcism and the magic spell. Heiler regards free prayer as true prayer, and he has less regard from what we might call liturgical prayer, that is, communal standardized prayers. Heiler claims that free prayers were the original prayers, while liturgical prayer merely imitates true prayer. He writes, "Prayer is at first a spontaneous emotional discharge, a free outpouring of the heart. In the course of development, it becomes a fixed formula, which people recite without feeling or mood of devotion, untouched both in heart and mind. At first, prayer is an intimate intercourse with God, but gradually it becomes hard, impersonal, ceremonial, a rite consecrated by ancestral custom. The factors conditioning this process of petrification are the frequent recurrence of the occasions for prayer, as well as their close connection with definite ritual acts. In origin, prayer is a direct communion with God, but when petrified into a ritual formula, the consciousness of God's presence and of immediate contact with Him threatens to disappear." Now, in the judgmental vocabulary that I've highlighted on the handout, Heiler implies that prayer worthy of the name is exceedingly rare outside low church Protestant settings. True prayer seldom occurs inside temples, synagogues, mosques, and most churches. In those structures, formulaic prayer is the norm. Heiler discounts the possibility that a worshiper who engages in intimate intercourse with God might utilize a fixed formula. In fact, many informants or observers could have told Heiler that a rite consecrated by ancestral custom can serve as the vehicle for worship carried out with deep feeling and a mood of devotion. For example, the anthropologist Tanya Luhrmann speaks of, on page 2, the combination of the very personal and the stereotype that is characteristic of religious expression around the world. Our honoree makes a similar point in Sacred Attunement, where he writes on page 2, although tradition may give formal expression to topics of human life, it does not exclude spontaneous prayer or the revitalization of traditional wording through new intentions or understanding. The life of prayer must register not only through the communal and historical voice of traditional prayers, but also by the new intentions one may give those old words. Emphasizing that multiple levels of meaning emerge from the coming together of communal text and individual devotee, Buzzy shows here that there's no need to set individual worship against traditional or communal worship. For Heiler, however, old words inherited from a liturgical tradition are a token of spiritual plagiarism and shallowness. Marcel Mauss's study on prayer contests the type of attitude that Heiler represents. Mauss emphasizes that prayer is not opposed to ritual. It is a type of ritual which he defines in the bottom of page 2 as an efficacious traditional act that is performed in conformity with a given prescription. So frequently and insistently does Mauss come back to the idea that there is no opposition between prayer and ritual, and that prayer is a social act, that it's clear he's polemicizing against the opposite point of view. I provide just a few examples of this from his monograph on pages 2 and 3 of the handout. The realization that a prayer is one type of ritual reminds us that we can put too much emphasis on a prayer's wording while neglecting its ritual context. For Mauss, prayer is not only a text to be analyzed, it is an activity that has a function. Focusing exclusively on its verbal content turns our attention to an arena that may be of little importance to a worshiper. Mauss criticizes scholars who, when studying prayer, seek, he writes, to determine the meaning of the words uttered by the worshiper rather than to explain their efficacy. These scholars, he complains on the top of page 3, scarcely went beyond the realm of belief. Prayer, which is a rite, escaped their notice. To understand prayer as poetry, in other words, one looks to its verbal sense. But to understand prayer as prayer, one attends to the result it is believed to engender. Similarly, Mauss realizes that prayer can be nonverbal. Certain bodily actions, fingering a rosary or winding phylacteries around one's arm, are as much a prayer as the Our Father or the Amidah. Mauss objects to scholars who misunderstand ritually oriented prayer in non-Protestant or even high church Protestant settings. That misunderstanding reaches its apotheosis in Heiler's book. In Religion in Essence and Manifestation, Gerardus van der Loo similarly notes the intimate connection of praise and sacrificial ritual, rejecting the assumption that these phenomena are in tension with each other. Unlike Heiler, he regards ritual as more basic and more archaic than prayer. We see the same trend in Philip and Carol Zalewski's book, Prayer, a History. Like van der Loo, the Zalewskis suggest that sacrificial rituals are older than prayer. Indeed, prayer sometimes functions as a substitute for sacrifice. They also reject Heiler's avowal that free prayer is more commendable than liturgical prayer. The Zalewskis explain that reciting a prayer one did not compose is an exercise in humility. By praying words of a common liturgy rather than one's own words, at a time that tradition dictates rather than at a moment that one chooses, worshippers confess that they are connected to something larger to which they yield some autonomy. The Zalewskis speak on the bottom of page 3 of the self-effacement needed in order to say prayers in unity with others. They continue, to perceive oneself as part of a book authored by God, to learn that one is written, not a writer, passive, not active, serve as gestures of submission. Abraham Joshua Heschel makes very similar statements on page 4 of the handout about liturgical prayer, which requires, he says, self-limitation. Worshippers restrain themselves so that a more august authority speaks through them. Liturgical prayer, then, is a type of sacrifice. For van der Loo, this is back on page 3, liturgical prayer is also a type of silence. He writes, "The standard terminology of the liturgy is an approximation to silence, and it is the experience of every celebrant and liturgist that while repeating the words of a liturgy, he must himself be silent. The strangeness of liturgical language is also an approach to silence." The insight that formulaic prayer is related to silence is not new. Maimonides, in the Guide, discusses the line from the Psalms, "L'chad dumiat tehillah," silence is praise to you. And Maimonides points out that any attempt that we make to praise God is at best deficient. Accordingly, he writes, silence and limiting oneself to the apprehensions of the intellect are more appropriate. But Maimonides does not disavow formulaic prayer. On the contrary, he regarded it as a daily requirement for all male Jews. Addressing free individual prayer, Maimonides describes people who, not satisfied with the formulaic text of the liturgy, spoke at great length and spent great efforts on prayers that they composed through which they, in their opinion, came nearer to God. Such free prayers, Maimonides maintains, are not commendable. Those who utter them are, he writes, truly ignorant. For Maimonides, as for Vanderloo, worshippers who recite the liturgy's wording ritually enact their own silence. The understanding of religion at work in Maimonides and Vanderloo is the opposite of Heiler's. The truly religious act for Maimonides and Vanderloo is not finding one's voice, but sacrificing it in the presence of something infinitely greater. Okay, with this quick tour through some phenomenologists and philosophers of religion, let's get back to biblical scholarship. The three approaches to Israelite worship found in the writings of Gunkel, Mowinckel, and Kaufmann correspond to the perspectives of Heiler, of Mauss, and of Vanderloo and Maimonides. Gunkel's approach to the Psalter recalls Heiler's view of prayer as distinct from ritual. Gunkel acknowledges that psalms were recited alongside sacrifices in the pre-exilic Jerusalem temple, but, he claims, most of those psalms disappeared from the textual record. The texts found in the canonical Psalter, according to Gunkel, utilized the forms of earlier temple psalms but were composed to be recited on their own. Thus, Gunkel refers to them as cult-free spiritual poetry, for they did not accompany sacrificial rites. The extant psalms are as distant from sacrifice, for Gunkel, as Heiler's free prayers are removed from ritual. Gunkel describes the era that produced our psalms as the period of piety, and he says of them on page 5 of the handout, "The psalmists of that period learned from the prophets' exalted models to evaluate the external worship service as inferior. Psalmody experienced a decisive change. Originally, psalmody arose from the cult and was closely bound to it, but now it turned its back on it. Pious individuals had learned to sing songs in which they disregard every external action. These songs were no longer designated for public worship." Skipping ahead a bit, "The individual appeared before God alone. Thus arose spiritual poetry, the particular treasure of the Psalter." For Gunkel, as for Heiler, external action is something that pious individuals learn to disregard. True prayers are no longer designated for public worship because religion as manifest in the Psalter is a matter of what he calls massive individualism. For Heiler, prayer was originally separate from ritual, but it fell from what we might call its state of grace when it was supplemented by sacrificial rites and then subordinated to them. Free prayers uttered at the dawn of religion were replaced by liturgical compositions that mimicked true prayers. Now, Gunkel's reconstruction initially seems different. For Gunkel, the spiritual prayers found in the canonical Psalter imitated and improved on pre-exilic cultic songs. But these two historical reconstructions present no contradiction. Heiler spoke of prayer among humanity's forebears in prehistory. He focuses on a prelapsarian world of worship wherein humans had not yet eaten from the tree of ritual. Gunkel attends to a much later period. The canonical psalms that Gunkel discusses are not among humanity's original prayers. They exemplify what we might call reformed prayer. Their authors restored prayer to something closer to what it had been in the prelapsarian world that Heiler imagines. A peculiarity of Gunkel's historical reconstruction demands comment. Gunkel emphasized that a text's genre directly reflects its life setting and its functions in the temple cult. Yet Gunkel insists that the Psalms found in the Book of Psalms are divorced from those settings. The authors of the Psalms in the Bible merely imitated older temple-based texts that are now lost to us. I think that Gunkel wants to treat the contents of the Psalter with esteem, which means, for someone with his Heilerian view of prayer, that prayer is opposed to religion, which means that Psalms found in Scripture cannot be too closely related to the temple cult. At the same time, Gunkel develops the paradigm-shifting insight that the Psalms genres are linked to settings and functions, a truly brilliant idea, which, however, linked the canonical Psalms from the Bible with ritual and the temple, which wouldn't be a good thing for Gunkel. Hence Gunkel's insistence that the canonical Psalms imitate rather than exemplify literary genres rooted in the cult. If one does not begin with a Heilerian view of prayer, then one can simply acknowledge the obvious. Psalms, as prayers, are intimately bound up with ritual. The reason they look like the sort of texts that were probably used in the temple is that they were probably used in the temple. It is precisely this approach that Mowinckel adopts in his many writings on the Psalms. He follows Gunkel in viewing genre, setting, and function as an integrated complex, but unlike Gunkel, he does not quickly break this threefold cord. In this sense, Mowinckel is more loyal than Gunkel to Gunkel's paradigm-shifting insight. Mowinckel thought that Psalms belonging to a genre functioned in the setting that produced the genre. He devotes a considerable portion of his Psalm studies to refuting Gunkel's argument that most of the texts in the Psalter are non-cultic songs. His attacks on Gunkel's reasoning employ a number of strategies. Above all, Mowinckel points to the wording in the Psalms that connects the Psalms to rituals. Psalms were sung by professionals, that is, Levites. Their phrasing is often stereotypical. Through their superscriptions, many Psalms associated themselves explicitly with Levitical families that performed music in the temple. Psalms often speak favorably or longingly about the temple. All these characteristics confirm Mowinckel's point that Psalms were temple-based. Mowinckel's thesis here recalls Mauss's insistence that prayer is itself a type of ritual. We saw earlier that in making this claim, Mauss serves as a foil to Heiler. In a similar way, Mowinckel functions as a foil to Gunkel. Thus, it's no surprise that for Mowinckel, ritual and communal elements of prayer do not compromise the prayer's spiritual value or inward emphasis. Mowinckel emphasizes, I'm about 4 lines from the bottom of page 5 here, that Gunkel's argumentation presupposes that actual cultic songs reveal nothing personal. But this assumption of Gunkel may be an unjustified assessment. Even cultic songs that were composed by living people, even cultic songs were composed by living people whose hearts were in cultic religion and who had, or at least could have had, religious experiences during festive cultic occasions. Why should they too not express their experiences and perceptions in their poems? Mowinckel's polemic here recalls Mauss's insistence that the ritual nature of an act does not prevent it from being spiritual, as well as Luhrmann's argument that the stereotypical can become deeply personal. Let's move on to Kaufmann. In his 8-volume masterwork, Toldot Emunah Yisraelit, Kaufmann famously and controversially maintains that the Aaronite priests performed their sacrifices in utter silence. Thus, he appears to posit a divide between prayer and ritual that recalls Gunkel's point of view. In fact, however, we'll see that Kaufmann's approach more closely matches Mowinckel because he too regards the Psalms as ritual texts. While Kaufmann contests many aspects of Mowinckel's work on the Psalms, both scholars emphasize that the Psalms function together with rituals inside the temple complex. Kaufmann writes on page 6 of the handout, like dance and the procession, song and psalm were part of the popular cult. psalmody tended to become formalized, more like cultic forms and less like prayer. Kaufmann's acknowledgement that psalmody played a role in the temple cult may come as a surprise to some, since Kaufmann is associated with the idea that the temple was a sanctuary of silence, a mikdash hadamama. Here, however, a misunderstanding needs to be cleared up. Contrary to the assumption of many biblical critics who reject Kaufmann's approach, but seem not to have actually read his work, Kaufmann never claims that song was absent from the Israelite temple. When he introduces his idea of a silent sanctuary, it's clear that he's speaking about the sanctuary as the Pentateuch's priestly source imagined it, the cult that priestly law prescribes. He never said that the Jerusalem temple in its entirety was a sanctuary of silence. Note his deliberate phrasing in the middle of page 6. An especially distinctive characteristic of the priestly Israelite sanctuary is that a sacred silence reigns within it. The priestly Israelite sanctuary is a kingdom of silence. The Israelite priesthood removed spells and psalms from its midst, fashioning a configuration of cult in which no speech, whether poetry or prose, has any place. In the cultic ceremonies of the P document, the activities of the priest are carried out in silence without a company of spell, psalms, or speech. This passage mentions the priestly sanctuary twice. It refers further to the P document, the priesthood, and the activities of the priest. Kaufmann's describing not Israelite worship in general, but worship as P thought it should be carried out. It is specifically the P document that wants to keep sacrifice separate from verbalization and music. Kaufmann maintains that the priests did not speak or sing as they performed rituals in the temple's altars. But he acknowledged that prayer and song occurred away from the altars, but within the temple complex. Elsewhere in the temple complex, other officiants, namely Levites, sang the psalms. In short, Kaufmann's claim is that priestly ritual at the altars knows no prayer. But for Kaufmann, Israelite religion was broader than priestly religion. Even temple religion was broader than priestly religion, since the priests were not the only ritual practitioners inside the temple complex. At a short remove from the altars, P's austere worship was not the norm. Thus Kaufmann writes, again on page 6, within the arena of the cult itself, the priestly limitations could not contain all the abundance of religious creativity. Around the zone of sacred silence of the temple building, the popular cult created its own sphere, brimming with movement and voices, tumult and excitement. Elements banished by the priestly cult found themselves a place within this sphere. Priestly and non-priestly worship, he makes clear, were distinct but adjacent realms. Kaufmann's claims about silent sacrificial worship apply only to the former, to the priestly realm. By the way, some of you will have noticed on the handout that Kaufmann's no doubt deliberate choice of loaded vocabulary to describe the popular Levitical cult. Shefa and Sphira, which I render here as abundance and sphere, of course, are also technical terms in Kabbalah. I think Kaufmann intends here to paint the priestly traditions as rationalist and the popular Levitical traditions as inclined towards mystical enthusiasm. I would hesitate to speak of slayfulness in the case of Kaufmann, but he is engaging in a certain double entendre here, I think intentionally. Kaufmann's distinction between two arenas in the temple recalls an observation that Mowinckel made. This is back in the middle of page 5. The temple cult consisted of more than bloody sacrifice. For Mowinckel, psalms were at home, especially in aspects of temple ritual beyond the immolations. Indeed, Mowinckel points out, the psalms speak little of sacrifice. Thus, in spite of Kaufmann's surface similarity to Gunkel in dividing sacrifice from song, Kaufmann comes closer to Mowinckel in claiming that psalms were non-sacrificial but nonetheless cultic. This understanding of psalms comes to the fore when Kaufmann explains that formulaic elements of the psalms attest to their cultic setting. Thus, the psalms language, for Kaufmann, was far more stylized than the language of ad hoc prayers recorded in biblical narratives. Psalms were often sung by professionals, the Levites. To put these insights into more recent scholarly language, psalms were highly ritualized in a way that distinguishes them from both ad hoc prayer of the sort that Heiler values and from the spiritual poetry that Gunkel imagines the Psalms to be. And this idea of poetry as ritualized, of course, I'm utilizing Laura's work on Piyut, which really applies beautifully to Psalms as Mowinckel and Kaufmann understand them. To use Mauss's terminology, both Mowinckel and Kaufmann understand Psalms as efficacious traditional acts. If Gunkel corresponds with Heiler and Mowinckel with Mauss, then Kaufmann's view, on closer inspection, allies less with the former and more with the latter. But in another respect, Kaufmann's discussion of worship is closest to the Zalewskis, to Heschel, to Vanderloo, and to Maimonides. The reason that P expels all forms of linguistic expression from sacrifice, Kaufmann asserts, is because of the association between magic and incantation. Magic in the ancient world involved the use of language along with rituals to control matter. It's for this reason that priestly authors refused to combine verbalization or song with sacrificial rites. While a popular cult that used psalms was present in the temple complex, as one approached God's actual dwelling place beyond the altars, the popular cult receded and priestly hegemony took hold. There, the priests performed elite rituals that shunned language. The priest favored silent worship, Kaufmann holds, because using language in worship was both dangerous and inappropriate. It was dangerous because, when combined with ritual action, it resembled the magic that Israelites were prohibited from practicing. It was inappropriate because the purpose of priestly ritual was not to engage in barter with God, nor to precipitate the granting of divine grace, but only to express awe towards God. For such a goal, language is likely to be a stumbling block. The words in which praise and petition are couched can flatter and beseech, and thus they orient prayer towards the human being's needs. The proper execution of a ritual sequence, on the other hand, serves as a pure expression of subservience. Thus, Kaufmann states, with the passing away of the magical justification for ritual acts, these acts were transformed entirely into a matter of decree, a divine commandment which has no reason and whose function is exclusively to symbolize submission of human will to divine will. The striving to distance the magical justification with its accompanying speech led to the stillness of the priestly cult. Silence took the place of speech, a silence which conveyed awe towards the holy. Physical, as opposed to verbal ritual, works especially well for this enactment of submission precisely because physical ritual carries no intrinsic meaning. A similar point was made famously by the anthropologist Fritz Stahl. I think this is page 6 of the handout, if I'm not mistaken. A widespread but erroneous assumption, Stahl writes, about ritual is that it consists in symbolic activities which refer to something else. It is characteristic of a ritual performance, however, that it is self-contained and self-absorbed. The performers are totally immersed in the proper execution of their complex tasks. Isolated in their sacred enclosure, they concentrate on correctness of act, recitation, and chant. Their primary concern, if not obsession, is with rules. There are no symbolic meanings going through their minds when they are engaged in performing ritual, end quote. Actions performed in silence, then, are the highest form of divine worship, in the basic sense of the word. They show reverence. They serve the divine other. Words have meanings that may focus more on the worshiper than on the object of worship. Pure, non-linguistic ritual, what Mauss terms manual as opposed to oral rites, escape this danger. Just as the priest sacrifices his voice to perform cultic ritual in Kaufmann's depiction of the silent sanctuary, so too the worshiper committed to liturgical prayer or formulaic prayer gives up her voice to recite a text dictated by tradition, according to the Zalewskis, Heschel, Vanderloo, and Maimonides. For all these thinkers, the pinnacle of worship leaves language behind, whether by replacing language with bodily ritual or by limiting language to formulas that tradition provides. A similar perspective, surprisingly enough, gets the last word in the Book of Psalms. Psalm 150, which is on page 7 of the handout, calls on all living creatures to praise God. The whole world, the psalm proclaims, should praise God with trumpets and lyres, with drums and cymbals, with the whole body in dance, but not with song. Conspicuously absent in the Psalms catalog of musical instruments is the human voice. Psalm 150 challenges the logocentrism of both liturgical and free prayer. In its climactic finale, the Psalter encourages a type of worship reminiscent of the nonverbal veneration that Kaufman finds in P. When we utilize the findings of biblical scholarship, along with the insights of phenomenologists and philosophers of religion, it becomes clear that Leviticus and Psalms are not opposites. They are two manifestations of a single religious impulse. For some biblical thinkers, and I use the term biblical thinkers to include both ancient Israelite authors and Jewish and Christian sages who draw upon the writings of those authors, for some biblical thinkers, language is a frail and all too human vehicle for religious expression, and various approximations of silence are the best way to convey one's love of God. Thank you very much.
All right, we'll now take a few moments for conversation and questions, and with any luck, I'll be able to bring this microphone over to the table.
Thank you, Alicia. One of the things that makes the body of Yanai's PU team so wonderful to study is that there's so much variety within the fixed structure. And in the Genesis, in the poem Lech Lecha, in Genesis 12:1, the strong use of sort of the dialogue of, sort of the second person, where the poet speaks to God in his own voice, and then God speaks back to Abraham, is really striking, because there are plenty of other poems where we have more variety of voice, where the poet sort of speaks in the plural, in we, or in a more of a distance or a narrative voice. There's so much variety in the way the poet uses voice and perspective throughout sort of the overall corpus, that it's clear that he had a lot of variety, and that there's a lot of intentionality in how he chooses to use voice in a different context. So you can so that you understand sort of that he is being very deliberate in how he's constructing a poem in a specific context. So I think when I look at how he's creating that sense of intimacy between God and Abraham, it's clearly deliberate in that poem, because I know there are other places where he takes a much more sort of remote, sort of larger perspective on how what kind of mood he's choosing to create for the congregation in terms of how they're relating to history. So I think a polar opposite example, for example, would be his. Last time I was here, I spoke about his poem on the Sotah, on the adulterous woman, and there, he's sort of like at arm's length, sort of like horror, just sort of he's really putting the community. They're sort of like the witnesses to this trial, and it's he's standing in a way through the poet. In that instance, they're sort of standing as he's standing with the people, and he's sort of like we, and they're like watching sort of this transpire. So it's clear that he's able to sort of locate himself with the community in sort of a number of different perspectives, which it really shows sort of how, for all that I don't know that the poets had sort of formal education. We know very little about sort of how he was trained. We know nothing about his biography. We're lucky to know his name, because he signed his name in the third unit of each poem. So we know nothing about sort of his background or even precisely when he lived. But it's clear that he had somehow picked up sort of some very good sense of sort of the kinds of techniques that orators and others would have used in antiquity to create sort of this sense of sort of vivid, you are there kind of sense among sort of the community.
Great points. So I'll sort of go in reverse order. Kola in Psalm 150, Kol neshama tahaleliyah, all breath should praise Yah, or really that could be all that has breath should praise Yah. How should all that has breath praise Yah? That might depend a little bit, first of all, how we interpret that phrase. When the psalmist says there, all that has breath should praise Yah, I wonder, is the psalmist referring to all humanity or to all living beings? That at some level, the birds and the animals, implicitly praise Hashem. And in that case, I think it's probably parakeets here in Hyde Park notwithstanding, nonverbal. Are the parakeets still here, by the way? They are, okay. When I was a student there, they had this huge nest right outside my apartment window, and they were incredibly loud. Anyway, it's in that case, I think it's nonverbal. Even if kol haneshama means humanity, we could include, well, what do we humans use our breath to do? We use it to produce words, and in that case, words are implied here. Or we could think that, well, maybe that's the breath that you need to play the flute or to perform the dance that's being discussed here. So I think it could go either way. And at the end of the day, look, the psalm is actually made up of words. So it's not completely rejecting a logocentric worship, but I think that it is going beyond a logocentric sort of worship, and that's interesting for the very last psalm of the Psalter. The Psalter, in some sense, is perhaps even gently critiquing itself, and that critique is a Maimonidean critique. On the question of prayer and males, so in the Yad, in Hilchot Tefillah, Maimonides actually talks about two different obligations that Jews have to pray. The D'oraita obligation for really what we might call free spontaneous prayer, that all Jews have a non-time bound non-time bound obligation to pray in a free spontaneous way, and there's a d'Rabbanan obligation to recite the fixed liturgical prayers. I would assume, and I may be wrong here, correct me if I'm wrong, that the first of those obligations, the sort of Hilarion obligation, which interestingly is part of Rambam, I didn't get into all of that in my paper, that applies to both Jewish men and Jewish women, but that the d'Rabbanan obligation to recite the fixed liturgy, which is, according to Maimonides, the best way to fulfill the first obligation, that applies specifically to men. But maybe I'm wrong about that. So yeah, for the D'oraita commandment, women would be obligated, but for the commandment of reciting specific liturgical prayers, that's the d'Rabbanan commandment that he discusses in chapter 1 of Hilchot Tefillah. And I would have assumed, but I may be wrong here, that applies specifically to men but not to women, because it's time bound. I honestly am not recalling in that discussion, in that particular volume, whether he mentions Josephus. My guess is that he does, because he must have known about it and he wouldn't have left it out. But honestly, I'm not recalling whether he mentions the letter of Aristeas specifically. Buzzy, do you happen to remember this from? It's easy enough to check, but I don't. It would make sense that he should, but I don't remember if he does. First and foremost, working simply from the texts in Leviticus and Numbers, the actual priestly passages, which, with three exceptions that he discusses in a detailed way, just never describe the priests as reciting anything. And that's so extraordinarily different from what we know of ritual and prayer in the ancient Near East. We've got so many collections of prayers, let's say, from Mesopotamia, that usually at the very bottom of the text will say epishtashu, and its ritual is, and then there's a description of what ritual you perform while reciting this. Or from descriptions of rituals, let's say the Akitu festival description, to take a famous example, here and there during the description of the rituals, they'll say, and here you recite the prayer, or the shu'illah, or the various types of prayers that are mentioned, and then they'll give you the incipit, the first line of the prayers. That's so extraordinarily rare in Leviticus and Numbers, and it's so extraordinarily rare in Psalms. I think that's where he's starting from, is the wording of Leviticus and Numbers, the wording of Psalms, and the contrast with the Akkadian language material, some of which was already known in his time, and that he does refer to.
First of all, I love Keter. That's one of my favorite books. So there's actually, I think it may be a delusion that afflicts people who study Piyutim, but the cadre of those of us who are immersed in it. But I think especially, and this I would limit it very explicitly to the classical piyutim, up to like the period of the 6th century and earlier. I draw a line to the I don't think this applies to the medieval period, and this is one reason actually why after I had a dissertation that went well into the medieval period, and when I wrote my first book, I said no more medieval. I went back and my first book was on Yanai precisely because of the question you raised about comprehensibility. But the Yanai and the other classical piyutim are very biblical in their language. And when I refer to them as being a mosaic of biblical language, that is really very true. And actually the first 3 units, each unit is followed by sort of almost like a key of biblical quotations. And those quotations, which are stacked at the end of each of the first 3 units, provide sort of a partial lexicon of sort of key texts which are going to be sort of like drawn on for a lot. And I think I would not say that that the synagogues in which these were performed were necessarily every storefront shtibel throughout the land of Israel. I don't think that these were I think these are probably fairly exceptional communities in some ways. But I do think that if you have a good knowledge of the Hebrew Bible, of the biblical text, you do not have to be able to compose the Mishnah Torah. You don't have to be able to sort of like compose, but if you have sort of a knowledge of the biblical text, you really can understand these piyutim. They're not, they're very biblical in their vocabulary. And like I said, the way that sort of they pull biblical verses with them. So they're not they're very biblical in their vocabulary. They're not, the way, and again, I mean, sort of in my dissertation, I spent a lot of time actually on sort of the ways that they, sort of the evidence for sort of the continued life of Hebrew in late antiquity and other things and the sort of alongside, sort of multilingualism in Jewish late antiquity. But I do think it's, in my world, there would not be so much Hebrew poetry being composed in late antiquity. There would not be such a vast repository of Hebrew poetry in the Cairo Geniza if it weren't comprehended. There just wouldn't be, there's just so much of the Cairo Geniza is piyutim. And it's clear from the way that poetry was not well treated and sort of the way it disappeared in things in the Middle Ages, you sort of tell when Hebrew fell out. But I think in late antiquity, at least in certain synagogues, it was still very much being heard and understood. And I think because it relied on biblical Hebrew and sort of the resonances in that way, and that it was pulling on, this coming out of sort of the same circles in which Midrash was being composed, and that it was sort of part and parcel of those same circles.
I guess we might say that if nobody understood him, he wouldn't have been asked back so often. But from the amount of texts that we've got in the Geniza, it's clear that they renewed the contract. And that's a really good point. I hadn't really thought of that, but that's a great point. So I wondered about that as well. So Art, in regard to your first question, as you point out, the Book of Psalms is quite varied. It is a very, very motley anthology, and Gunkel and Mowinckel are very, very aware of that. I mean, one of the great things that Gunkel did is he provided us with these ways of classifying the many different kinds of psalms found in the Psalter. That having been said, now with some types of psalms, especially when they're phrased in the first person plural, and when they have obvious explicit refrains, and when the Levites are telling different groups of people, it's your turn. Yomar na Beit Aharon ki le'olam chasdo, Yomar na Beit Yisrael ki le'olam chasdo. Yeah, that's obvious. Those are obviously liturgical texts. But there are, as you point out, also both psalms of crisis, what English language biblical scholars often call psalms of lament. I prefer calling them psalms of crisis. And the Thanksgiving psalms, when they're in the first person singular, they can have a much more personal sound to them. But what both Mowinckel and Kaufman point out is that when you look at 10 different individual psalms of crisis, or 10 different individual Thanksgiving songs, you see the same elements, let's say for the Psalms of Crisis, the same 5 elements always showing up, beginning with a particular element and usually ending with another. The other 3 can be in any order. You see a lot of the exact same phrasing showing up, and scholars have kind of like, come up with these lists of phrasings. And that makes it clear. Again, Laura's work on Piyut is very helpful here for a biblical scholar methodologically. All of this stereotype phrasing and structuring devices make it clear that what might look to us like highly individual poems are actually quite stereotypical in the culture that produced them. And therefore, I think that is one among a number of indicators that they probably are indeed cultic. That is, they probably were functioning within the temple. Furthermore, the Psalms of Crisis do often end with a vow or a promise to bring a sacrifice. So sometimes they do themselves explicitly link to the temple. I hope that 3 weeks from now I'm not dead, that the crisis has passed, and I'll be able to come and present a zevach at the temple. The Psalms of Thanksgiving sometimes do seem to, and Psalm 30 is a good example, refer to an actual zevach that the person has just presented or is about to present. So actually, when you read a whole bunch of them together, it does turn out to be the case that in some ways, that in significant ways, these individual songs in the Psalter, they too are probably very much temple-based, probably originate in the temple. They too are quite ritualized.
I apologize. We need to stop. And I'm cutting off. Sorry. We don't take a short break in which time Professor Fishbane.
You just know how scared we are when we get called on.
Please join me in thanking both Laura and Ben.